Welcome to the Week 2 edition of Sleepers and Stacks. We actually didn't do this video for Week 1, so we are adding it for your viewing pleasure for Week 2. Jim, this is a new one for you. This is new territory, so how you feeling about covering some new topics in Week 2?
You know, we have to be brave when we're challenged like this, you know? It's difficult. We're talking fantasy football. It's always pretty easy. And it's enjoyable just talking football anytime. But with stacks, I think it's particularly interesting just because it's kind of a game theory to an extent. You're trying to figure out what's the best combination, what's the best share of an offense that you want. And not even just best, but also playing the market. You know, like being contrarian kind of plays in a little bit more sometimes with stacks. So it's just an interesting kind of market strategy.
Exactly, and the definition of sleepers, there really is no sleepers anymore. You know, everyone follows fantasy football so closely, so we're going to really try and find you guys that people are fast asleep on, not just taking a nap. But before we get there, we got a great offer for you. Of course, promo code CURVE at RotoCurve.com that both Jim and I love so much. Just enter promo code CURVE in the coupon box. You get things like exclusive position rankings, projections, premium cheat sheets, must-have tools like DVP, points per attempt, red zone utilization, and more. Optimized DFS lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel. You get access to player ownership percentage after Thursday night kickoff. All of this is for $5 instead of $7. And list of things that I think you can get for $2. Jim, have you ever been to Jack in the Box and gotten those tacos? Those are some of my favorite. I think you can get 4 tacos for $2. It's either
on the East Coast, we don't have Jack in the Box, unfortunately.
Yeah, we don't have it in the Midwest either. So anytime I go on vacation, I always get me some Jack in the Box tacos. They are cheap.
Yeah.
You get a bunch of those with the $2 you're saving. But let's go to sleepers.
$2 and feel like $1 inside.
Exactly. Let's go to sleepers. I think the tacos are a sleeper food, to be honest with you. But in terms of sleepers this week in NFL, we've covered a lot in some of the other videos. But let's both review and talk about some others. Who do you think are some nice sleepers for daily fantasy this week?
All right, some sleepers that we'd already have talked about. Shane Vereen. Again, like you said, the unearthing sleepers isn't so easy anymore because everybody's on Twitter, everybody's checking out game film, everybody has all 22 taped. I mean, my grandma was talking about all 22 last week. Not really, but seriously, the analysis, the information's everywhere, so unearthing these guys is more difficult. Instead of Shane Vereen, let's go with Travis Cadet. Like last week, I foolishly said C.J. Spiller was a sleeper, but really what I meant is that passing down role is a sleeper role. We assume that Mark Ingram is going to always get these catches, but I think that was more by default last year. They didn't pay Spiller, $10 million to have 100 snaps like they got. I think they really actually do rely on. First of all, the best stat is the Saints lead the league over the last 2 years in targets to their running backs. So this is even post Darren Sproles. They're still doing this. It's part of that offense. So Cadet's a guy who you can get super, super cheap. It's going to be in a shootout, so you can imagine some hurry-up offenses where he's the guy. So as a counter to say everybody thinking that Vereen might be interesting, I think Cadet could be a PPR back you could like. And then a sleeper at receiver that I'll mention that no one's going to be on this one is Kenny Stills. He only caught 1 pass last week, but he had 6 targets, and the average depth of target was 29.8 yards downfield. That's ridiculous. That means every single time he was, targeted, it was a deep ball. If you watch that game, even though it wasn't that pretty, he actually dropped a wide open touchdown that he could have hauled in, would have been a big play. That's also an issue because Kenny Stills might not be that good, but at the same time, he was plenty good in sharp route running and getting catches with the Saints. I think there is some upside here. And more importantly, he's playing above Parker, who's still hurt, Devontae Parker. I just think Kenny Stills has the ability to get past the defense once or twice and make a day for you. Maybe like a 3-catch, 80-yard, and a touchdown type day.
Yeah, I mean, that drop was brutal. But that being said, he was wide open. He was downfield. So you got to respect his ability to get open. All he's got to do is haul that in. Hopefully he gets another chance this week if you are rostering him. I'm going to go with my sleepers to start. I mentioned LeGarrette Blount in one of the other segments, but starting a New England back is always difficult, and I think people will say they like him, and then they're going to look at their final lineup and be like, I can't use him. He can very easily zero, especially if they're people who are single entering. So I think LeGarrette Blount is a guy that people are on, but are not going to end up using when it's all said and done. I like Theo Riddick. Again, it's a very difficult matchup, but I really liked what I saw from him last week, and I think him as a receiver is different than, the NFL, what they have to offer in terms of receiving backs. I think he can move all over the field, and I think he can still find a way to beat a defense that allowed the fewest receptions to the position. And I also think he's going to get some carries, and he's got some burst. So he looked like the better back to me. If they're going to be solid against rushing backs, then I think Riddick's going to move around. They're going to find a way to replace the running game with a short passing game. So I really like Riddick as a guy who's not many people are going to be on. And we already mentioned Woodhead. I'm not sure he's going to be a sleeper.
Right.
But at 5,200, his price went up. He did have 80 receptions last year in a PPR format. There's definitely a lot to like there. At the wide receiver position, we mentioned some guys that are cheaper. I like Steve Smith for cash games, but I'm not sure that's quite the sleeper. I'm going to go with some guys for tournaments for my sleeper. How about Tyrell Williams, who we already mentioned? I think a lot of people are going to like Benjamin as the guy who's the number one without Allen, but I like Williams, who's the number two, who was targeted a fair amount. We mentioned guys in the other video like Tajay Sharp, who I think a lot of people have kind of figured out, but still they look at that matchup. You mentioned they don't shadow receivers, so people may have my first inclination and say, Sharp against a good corner, I want to wait and see there. And how about Will Fuller against the Kansas City team that looked pretty bad last week? I mean, I'm not sure people are going to buy into that burst from Fuller because, DeAndre Hopkins is on that team, and that's the guy they're going to look to. But, Kansas City lost Sean Smith in the offseason, and their defense certainly looked like it in week number one. So I think Fuller's another guy who's, couldn't get deep. You're talking about those average depth of targets. Fuller's a guy who's not going to be targeted in the 1 to 2 yard range very often. He's a guy who's got some nice speed. He had a big week. So I think, Fuller, Tyrell Williams, and I'm going to go Terrell Pryor with Josh McCown, making that quarterback switch. He's just a guy who's looked really good to me. I know he was a quarterback. He looks like a wide receiver now, and there's nothing really to be scared of with this Baltimore team. Is there any other sleepers that we missed?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's weird because, you do this research and then you assume that the stuff you like is going to be universally liked. For example, I like Justin Forsett a lot. I don't know if the market will. I really don't. I just want shares of blowouts on the good side. And I think particularly with the running backs, I think Forsett could be really busy. It wasn't that long ago. It was just last October that he had 170 yards from scrimmage against this very same Browns team. This Browns team is actually worse than that team was, if that's possible. So, there's really just, like I said, they're punting the season, the Browns. So getting any shares against them is going to be nice. I think West is a guy people might like for touchdowns, but in these leagues that we've talked about, in fantasy draft, in DraftKings, these are point per reception leagues. And so getting guys who can do that is helpful. Forsett isn't wildly efficient in the passing game, but hey, 3 to 4 catches plus 15 rushes, I think there's a chance for him to really actually have, one of the nicer days at that price point. So he's a guy. And then Mike Wallace to counter your Steve Smith. I do think Smith is probably the safer play for volume. He's going to get 9-10 targets security blanket-wise, but I think, again, sticking with that vertical average depth of target thing, Mike Wallace might, only need 4 catches to give you, a 15, 16-point fantasy day.
Yeah, and the last guy I want to touch on is Zach Miller because we haven't really gone into tight ends. But you look down the stretch last year. This is from 11-15 on. 5 targets, 6 targets, 7 targets, 1 target, 6 targets, 6 targets, 8 targets. And then he started this year with 4 targets. I mean, the issue with him is always health. And now Martellus Bennett is gone. So really all the tight end looks should go through him. The Eagles were kind of middle of the road, but Zach Miller, $3,000 on DraftKings. That's a guy that I think is going to see a lot of attention. If Cutler's running for his life at any point, this is going to be the guy who's his safety blanket. And I think you look at those target numbers last year down the stretch, and I think those should, again, be on the horizon as soon as Miller is healthy. And I think after a week in the books that you can kind of expect an uptick in production from him. Another guy, I'm going to go with the tight end on the other side as the other guy that I want to mention is Brent Selleck with Zach Ertz listed as week to week. I just don't have a ton of faith in this Bears defense as a whole, and it's the same situation of I love the guys who it goes from 2 tight ends worth of production to 1. Selleck's going to get all the looks. You don't have to guess whether it's Ertz or Selleck anymore, and he's even cheaper at $2,600. So you're looking for those sleepers. But let's get into stacks because that's what wins people the money. Last week we discussed some stacks, even though we didn't have a specific video. But, maybe it's QB wide receiver tight end. Maybe it's QB running back wide receiver. Maybe it's just QB wide receiver that you think is going to win the millie this week. But who are the ones we want to use in those, larger tournaments that are going to get us a chance at first place?
Well, I mean, the obvious one is that everyone's going to pay is that $17,000 stack between Eli Manning and Beckham. That's the kind of the chalk one. But even I wouldn't be too afraid, even in tournament. Sure, it's going to be highly owned, but if it's going to score, 60 plus fantasy points together, then I guess it can actually pay itself off. A little more contrarian than that, if you want to save money, maybe even Eli and Victor Cruz. I know people like Shepard, the rookie, but he really wasn't targeted a ton. He had to pull in that touchdown. He did flash that 40-inch vertical, which was nice, but almost like you said, the Steve Smith thing, I think there's a little bit of a security blanket kind of narrative play here that Eli likes to look for this guy with all the years they have under their belt. That's one stack that's interesting. Also, Joe Flacco, Mike Wallace. We already talked about Mike Wallace and Joe Flacco separately in their respective position videos. But I think there's the potential here for that to really pay off. It's not a very expensive stack. It's only, what do I have it here? It's only 11-2 on DraftKings together. And then, the other one that I think you will mention or you're interested in is Mariota Sharp. I mean, I don't know if you're into Sharp as much, but that's only $10K that set up. And then if we're going to see a shootout happen, Blake Bortles does all of his production trailing. We know that, but I'm not a huge fan of Bortles in general. But 14-5 on DraftKings for Bortles and Allen Robinson in a game that could, trend over 50 points in the over-under category. I think there's a potential there for them to at least connect once. And if they connect twice, then obviously that pays off.
Yeah, I think a stack that I'm really going to be on in tournaments this week is Phillip Rivers, Danny Woodhead, Tyrell Williams, because I don't think that a lot of people, even though Woodhead basically is a pass-catching back, are willing to do the quarterback, running back, wide receiver thing. And I think, if they're going to go off and we really like them to against this Jacksonville team, then it's going to be, Woodhead's going to be involved in that. I mean, he's targeted in the red zone. He's used in the red zone. He scored a red zone touchdown last week. And then, some of these wide receivers who we like are targeted well downfield. So you got one of the short targets eating up, yardage in the short, and he's only $5,200. Then you got a guy who can maybe score you a long touchdown. So I really like that Phillip Rivers idea. Andy Dalton, A.J. Green, you already mentioned in another video how good A.J. Green's been against Pittsburgh. I mentioned how consistent Andy Dalton was last year. He was consistently over 20 points, and he was in 25 to 30 territory, which is, for a $6,400 price tag, we're starting to talk about, GPP winning for that kind of, cost. So I really like that. Mariota, if I'm pairing him with someone, it's Delaney Walker. I really think this sets up as a Delaney Walker type game. I do like Sharp, but the Lions, pretty susceptible to tight ends. They allowed, I think it was the 4th most fantasy points last year and the most touchdowns. Yeah. So that definitely interests me when you're talking about Walker, who caught 90 passes last year and easily led the position. Mariota Walker, we didn't get to tight ends, but Walker is the guy I have locked and loaded into cash games. I actually think he's so viable that this could be one of those big Walker games where you need him in tournaments. And then, some of the interesting ones, how about Carson Palmer and Larry Fitzgerald? They are implied to score over 28 points again. And I know people look at that wide receiving core and think it's frustrating. But, Tampa Bay actually was tough on number one wide receivers last year. They were a little bit more lenient elsewhere, but each of these guys move to different spots in the formation. So it's kind of hard to go, just look at DVOA and Football Outsiders and go.
Works out of the slot quite often, yeah. So
exactly, and slot receivers against them, 34% more production than average. So I really like the spot here for Larry Fitzgerald. And just another one as an honorable mention, because I do like Josh McCown. I'm going Josh McCown and Terrell Pryor. And I think you could even include Barnage there. Maybe we get a big game from McCown. I don't think anyone would go McCown and 2 receivers, but this Baltimore team just is not good. McCown's minimum price, you can still fit things around them. So, you go McCown, Pryor, Barnage, then you can fit Antonio Brown and pretty much anyone else you want. So that's interesting to me. I don't think a lot of people will be on it. Did we miss any stacks?
No, I think we covered them all. I mean, the one that probably won't it probably won't be that productive because I'm going to mention it is Wentz and Jordan Matthews. Wentz and J-Matt. I mean, I'm in Philadelphia, so the radio constantly is just talking about sports radio's in love with Wentz. They're anointing him a superstar already. He did have a nice game last week. This will be more of a challenge. I think that's a pretty fast front seven for the Bears. I'm just not sure how much pressure they create. So there's potential. It's obviously just a tournament stack, but I think it's only 12-4 to afford it, and you're getting a lot more reliability out of the receiver than some of these other stacks.
Yeah, Kyle Fuller looks like he will play this week, but I'm not sure how much that matters. I mean, Kyle Fuller hasn't exactly –
Matthews works out of the slot, so it depends if he's going to, work the nickel or work inside. So it's all – I think that's one thing we have to watch out for. Like, I love mentioning cornerbacks, but we also got to, try to talk about their tendencies. Not that you're not. I'm just saying it's I think sometimes we avoid situations that might not play out. It's kind of like real life.
Right. And one that I really think needs to be mentioned was the Eli Vereen stack.
Yeah.
If you're not going to use Beckham in tournaments, which I think is going to be pretty contrarian. Use Eli and some of his other guys, and I think you can find yourself a nice spot. If for whatever reason they're, shadowing Beckham with Vaccaro, or they decide to do some different things like the Cowboys have done against him, you can find some big days from the other guys. Because I think one sure thing is that Manning's going to have a nice week. The question is to who. Right. So there's a stack there.
Watch Donnell get 2 touchdowns just to make us look like idiots. So.
I'm not opposed to Donnell. They were so bad against tight ends. Donnell scored last week. I'm really not that opposed to him.
I mentioned one tight end, not to cut you off, would be Dennis Pitta. I mentioned it before. He's back from the dead. I mean, there's a guy who hasn't played football in 2 years. It's kind of like the Victor Cruz of tight ends here. But I just think he led the team in routes run by a great amount. He had 32 routes, and the next closest tight end had like 9. I just think there's a potential here. Again, I just want to load up against this Browns defense almost every week.
Yeah, there is something we will never disagree on. This Browns defense is just bad. Before we go, promo code CURVE saves you $2 on a weekly membership at RotoCurve.com. Again, what do you get with promo code CURVE? You get exclusive rankings, projections, premium cheat sheets, tools like DVP, points per attempt, things like that, optimized DFS lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel, access to player ownership percentage. Use promo code CURVE, and you only pay $5 instead of $7. That's all for us for week 2. Good luck, everyone. Hopefully one of our followers or one of us wins the Millie. I know that if I do, it'll be a nice little vacation in the next month or so. So I will catch you.
Show solo if you win the million.
Exactly. I will catch you on the other side of $1 million next week.